All right, welcome back, everybody. This is the Jason Stapleton program, broadcasting once again from deep behind enemy lines, and here in sunny Southern California. And I'm so glad that you're joining me here today. If it's the first time that you're visiting us, thank you for being in attendance. As you know, well, you don't know because it's your first time, but we discuss liberty on this show and the principles of libertarianism as it relates to what I call the 5 principles of liberty, which are limited government, individualism, peace, tolerance, and free markets. So if any of those 5 things sound even remotely familiar or appealing to you, then I think you're going to enjoy the show. And there may be the off chance that you are here just so that you can try and prove somebody else wrong and say that you listen to my show and that you don't agree with anything that I have to say. And that's cool. I'm really welcome you being here. And what I hope is that as the show unfolds, you will recognize that we have far more in common and far more that we share than splits us up or what separates us. And the reason that I say that is libertarian principles are a little bit different than what you may be accustomed to. There's not this left and right paradigm where we are constantly at odds. Really, I think as human beings, we all kind of want the same thing. So we all want there to be less poverty. We all believe in this concept, or at least most of us believe this. There are some people who don't, but most of us believe in charity and the importance of giving of our own free will to those in need. And we believe that if we have been given much, or if we have achieved much in our lives, that we have there's a sense of responsibility there that we should be providing for those who are less fortunate. I think there's also a general belief among all of us that we want to protect our environment, that we don't want to just litter and pollute the land and the seas that we live in. And I think that there is a belief among most of us that you should have the right to do what you want as you see fit, as long as you don't hurt anybody else in the process. And those are the principles of libertarianism. They really are. Now, where we come at odds and where there is dissension among us, and maybe between you and me, I don't know, but where there is dissension, it comes with how we actually achieve those ends. So if we both agree that it's important to be charitable, well, then how do we ensure that charity is a part of our lives and a part of our society? Well, libertarians would believe that it is your individual responsibility to be charitable. That if you believe that something is important, like if you believe that giving to the homeless is important, for example, then you have the right and responsibility to give as much as you feel you can and to do your best to convince others to do the same. What you don't have the right to do, and we as libertarians believe, is to go to someone's house and say, hey, you know what? I don't feel like you're being charitable enough. I feel like you should be giving more of what you have. And so I'm going to ensure that that happens by using the government, by using force to compel you to give. See, that in our estimation, in estimation of a libertarian, is not charity. That's just straight up theft. You've just taken from someone in order to give to someone else. Now, you may think that this is fine under certain conditions and not under others. However, I look at that, and I say we as libertarians, I should really speak for myself, but I look at that and say, well, if it is okay to steal, as long as we do something good with the money, well, then there is really no limit to what I can do at the sake of doing something good with the money. I can come to your house, I can take everything you have or the majority of it, because it's all what is enough. When we talk about fair share, what is someone's fair share? It's a completely subjective term. It has no real meaning, no real value. And so your fair share could be 90% of what you have, because 90% of what you have is more than the poorest person in the world has. I mean, we as Americans, if you live a middle income life in America, you may feel like you're just getting by, but you are the top 1% of the top 1% in the world. You are wildly wealthy compared to many others in the world around you. So we look at this and we see these terms as, I see these terms as subjective. And so what I think creates the most amount of wealth, the most amount of opportunity for the most amount of people is these ideas, principles of liberty that I talk about on the show. Again, they're limited government, individualism, peace, tolerance, and free markets. Those are the things that will create the most amount of wealth and opportunity for the most amount of people. And so what I try and do each and every day on this show is explain those things to you using the news that's in front of us. And what you hear from the mainstream media is nothing like what you're going to hear from me. And so I hope that you find this as a source and a refuge from, all of the garbage that's out there. Now, the other thing that I do on this show that you may or may not be familiar with is I do not do news in a vacuum. So what you see in the drive-bys is they know that they've got about 10 to 15 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to capture your attention and to hold your attention. And after that, you're going to be on to something else. People do not listen to daytime news for hours and hours and hours on end. You, people who listen to podcasts and listen to political talk all the time are the only people who do that. So those people who don't, the media has about 5 to 15 minutes to kind of capture their attention. So they go from story to story to story. They rehash the same story, tell it the same way, just bring on a couple of different pundits to talk about it. And they essentially tell the same thing over and over and over again until there's a new story that's hotter. And then they dump the old story and they move on to the new one. That is not what is going to happen here. We do not do news in a vacuum, which means I am going to be referring back to things that we talked about in other episodes to help you build a complete picture of the world around you. That's one of the things that we're going to be doing today. We've been talking a lot about interest rates, and we're talking about cryptocurrencies, and we were talking about government shutdowns and what's going to happen if the government shuts down, if interest rates rise, what's up with cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and all these different things. All of that stuff is discussions that we're going to kind of culminate in a discussion in something we're doing today on Venezuela. And so if you have trouble understanding, if I'm referring back to things and you're like, I haven't listened to those episodes, Jason, fear not. They're all on the web. All you got to do is download them. What I suggest you do is you take the 10 episode challenge. You go back, you listen to the last 10 episodes so that you can get caught up. And I guarantee you, if you go back and listen to the last 10 episodes, you'll be a listener for life. People just stick because now they have a fuller and more complete picture of the world. And what they find is that this is different than anything else that they're going to listen to. So thank you so very much for being here. That is my pitch here in the AM. And let's go ahead and get started here on this shutdown business. Now, as we talked about earlier yesterday, the shutdown is a joke. This is a huge problem for nobody. Because the only thing that's going to happen here is that if the government shuts down, it's going to shut down temporarily, and they're going to furlough a bunch of people. And then when they finally come to an agreement, when these politicians finally go through whatever game it is they're playing, all these people who've been furloughed, quote unquote, without pay will be brought back. They will have all of their pay reimbursed to them. All the money that they lost will come back, and they will end up going back to work with nothing but a nice week or 2 week paid vacation. That's what happens every single time the government shuts down. Everybody gets their checks. Nobody goes without food. It's ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. There has been no long-term shutdown. This is a political game that politicians play, and they try and freak you out about all the stuff that's going to happen if it fails. When in reality, what they're doing is they're trying to determine who's going to get blamed for the shutdown. Are the Republicans going to get blamed or the Democrats going to get blamed? And yesterday on the show, I gave you my 2 cents about that. I think that in the end, the Republicans are the ones that take this on the chin for a myriad of reasons. But today, Trump decided to inject a little more confusion into the perilous shutdown negotiations by tweeting out that he did not think that the Child Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, should be part of the short-term budget agreement. Now, if you remember from yesterday, one of the things that the Republicans were trying to do to get the Democrats to sign off on this short-term bill was giving them this 6-year extension on CHIP. And this was something that they were getting that because they couldn't do the Dreamer thing. They couldn't do the DACA deal. They're like, look, we can't give you that because that's what the whole negotiation broke down on that. There's no way we can do that in this short-term deal, but we'll give you this CHIP thing that you've been looking for. And that can get us through to February. So that'll pay the bills until February 16th. Then we can work on sorting out the rest of this DACA stuff. And maybe we can get some sort of budget together by then. Now they won't. We'll be in the same situation on February 16th, but in the meantime, they were going to get this CHIP thing done. Now the president comes out and says he's not in favor of that. He says, quote, CHIP should be part of a long-term solution, not a 30-day or short-term extension. Now, this is a problem because his own administration, the White House Budget Office, sent Congress a letter expressing support for the overall bill on yesterday, saying, quote, the administration supports the bill's multi-year funding extension of the Child Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. And so you ask yourself, see, if you listen to a guy like Rush Limbaugh, now what Rush is going to tell you is that Trump is a master. He's masterfully negotiating all of this. And whoa, he's got these guys on their heels and they don't know what to do and they are absolutely lost. This guy's such a genius. He's one of the most amazing human beings to ever walk the earth. He's so much smarter than all of the rest of them. You have no idea. When in reality, I think the man is just a little unhinged. I don't think there's a plan to this at all. And all you have to do to disprove Rush Limbaugh's theory on this is talk to anybody inside the White House who's had dealings with him. It would appear as though the man is flip-flops all over the place all the time, that he doesn't really understand a lot about what's going on. I mean, here's the thing. Reagan really didn't understand a lot about what was going on. That's why they tried to keep him away from any specifics, talking about any sort of specifics when he was in the White House. Because he didn't really have the clarity and the depth of the issues. What he was really good at was talking to the press. And so he would give these speeches and he would banter with the press and have a good time. But they really tried to keep him out of walking into any sort of like deep dive of policy because he didn't really deal with that a lot. Now, Trump's kind of the same way. He doesn't have any deep, I don't think he's got any deep philosophical beliefs. But I also think that he doesn't have any deep understanding of the political issues that are at hand. I think what he is really, really good at is acting crazy. Now, he goes back and he's talking about this wall because one of the things that he wants is a wall. He wants the wall paid for, and that has to be part of this short-term deal that they're signing, or there is no deal. This is what his big concern is. Now, the reason for that is he wants to fulfill on his obligation and what he told the people he was going to do. But during the election, he didn't say that America was going to pay for the wall. He said that Mexico was going to pay for the wall. So this creates a problem for him, and he has to overcome this hurdle as well because now he's got a messaging issue that he's got to deal with. So he comes out and he tweets out adding that the wall, will be paid for, quote, directly or indirectly or through long-term reimbursements by Mexico, which has a ridiculous $71 billion trade surplus with the U.S. So if I'm understanding his rationale and his line of thinking here, what the president is saying is we will either get them to pay for it somehow in the future, which we don't really understand how, or, we're going to figure out a way to get our money back through the trade surplus that we have with them so that we keep more of our money, and therefore that money would have been used to pay for the wall. Therefore, we're paying ourselves back. That may be the way he's looking at it. But this idea that he's going to go and force the Mexicans, the Hispanics, the Mexicans, I'm trying to think of this politically acceptable way to say that. I don't know why I would care, but yeah, to get Mexico to pay for this wall, when in reality, there's absolutely no chance that that's ever going to happen. He says if there is no wall, there is no deal. He said they need the wall to, quote, help stop the massive inflow of drugs from Mexico, now rated #1 most dangerous country in the world. Well, here's a wild and crazy idea. Why don't you just legalize these drugs? Now, I know that's a crazy idea for a lot of people. Well, you're going to have heroin addicts wandering around here? How, that's absurd, Jason. That's crazy talk. But the reality is all of the violence that we see, all of the problems in Mexico exist because of drug cartels. There is a good on the market right now that you can't get unless you go to the black market. And people want it. And if they want it, they're going to find a way to get it, and somebody's going to be able to supply it to them. We saw the same thing during Prohibition. You can't just outlaw alcohol and have no alcohol. What you get is the mafia. You get the mob. And then guess what happens? As soon as you legalize liquor, that's how they made all of their money. That's how the Kennedys made their money, by the way. Running liquor. Now, you get done with that and you legalize liquor again. Guess what? What do these guys have to go to? Where'd they go? They went to drugs and gambling. Two things that were still illegal. And so if you continue to knock these things off, these people will have nowhere to go. They'll have to get involved in legitimate businesses. Or they'll have to stay inside of this illegal framework, this black market framework of stuff that people want, but the government won't allow you to buy on the open market. So if you have a problem with drugs coming from Mexico, the answer is not to spend billions of dollars and trillions of more dollars in enforcement in order to protect us against something that's going to come here no matter what, because the amount of money coming in the drug trade far surpasses anything that they're going to be able to build in a wall. They could literally get heavy equipment and tunnel 50 miles underground if that's what they had to do to get into America. And that's exactly what they would do. They will find a way to get the drugs in here. You build a wall, guess what? We're connected to the ocean. They'll come by sea. They'll swim it up with scuba divers. They'll drop it off out in the ocean with boats. They'll do whatever they have to do to get the drugs here because it is that profitable of a business. California is finding out just how profitable a business that is because they have legalized marijuana for recreational use out here. And they've slapped a 6 or 7 or 10%, I can't remember what kind of tax it is, on the marijuana here in California. They are going to generate billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in revenue from marijuana sales, just like they did with cigarette taxes. Now, they'll waste that money. They'll squander it because that's what the California government does. But the point is, the new drug lords are the government. And the difference is it's coming through capitalist enterprises. The people are making money. They're opening legitimate shops where quality and purity testing is done. And people are able to come in the open, purchase what they want, and not have to worry about the cops showing up. And they're not going to pay an exorbitant amount of money over what the market will bear in order to be in the black market. Now, if you're confused about black markets, we'll talk about that when we get to Venezuela. But my point here being is that you don't need a wall to solve this problem. In fact, a wall won't solve the problem. All the wall is going to do is waste time and money. But President Trump wants you to believe that if you just built this wall, that the world would be right. And he's holding it over everybody's head, not because it will actually make a difference to anyone's lives, but because he wants to fulfill on a campaign promise that he made so he doesn't look foolish. That's what it's about. And it is utterly and completely ridiculous. Okay, guys, let me tell you about one of the great sponsors on our show, Stamps.com. You guys are making New Year's resolutions. How about one to save a little bit of money, right? Now, everybody hates going to the post office. It's cumbersome. You got to drive across town. You got to stand in line. You got to do all this stuff. They weigh the package. It's a time out of your day that you don't have to be spending because Stamps.com brings the services of the post office right to your fingertips. You can buy and print U.S. official postage, any letter, any package, any class of mail using your own computer and printer, and then the mailman picks it up from you. How great is that? Stamps.com will even help you decide the best class of mail so that you save time and money. Print postage day or night. A lot of you guys are starting your businesses. I got my online business Kickstarter course that's currently open. You save $100 off of it, and you're wondering, okay, how am I going to ship all this stuff? I got to work at night because I'm still working my day job to get my secondary job off the ground. That's what you do when you're hustling. Well, Stamps.com, anytime, day or night, print that postage, have it ready to go, you're all done. Now, Stamps.com, because you listen to my show and because I love Stamps so much, they're giving you a very special deal, a 4-week trial plus postage and a digital scale with no long-term commitments. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone in the top right-hand corner of the homepage, and type in my last name, Stapleton. That's Stamps.com, and make sure you enter my promo code Stapleton so that they know that you came from me. All right. This is an awesome article from AFP News, and it's the United Kingdom. And it's a global warming piece. And I want to read it for you because when I read the headline, worst case global warming scenario not credible, study finds. So I'm looking at that going, oh, okay, we got a little anti-global warming deal here. And I started reading the article and all sounded good, and then it turned terribly bad. So I want to explain to you what's happening here so that you guys understand. It says the Earth's surface is almost certainly not warming up 4 or 5 degrees Celsius by 2100, according to a study released Wednesday, which, if correct, voids the worst-case UN climate change predictions. Now, you would think if you stopped reading right there, which the majority of people will do, you would think to yourself, that's it. Global warming's not a problem anymore. Clearly, everything's fine. Then you continue reading. It says, a revised calculation of how greenhouse gases drive up the planet's temperature reduced the range of possible end-of-century outcomes by more than half, researchers said in a report published by the Journal of Nature. Now, I'm reading this, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, let me just give you my view on global warming for those of you who are new, because I have no doubt that climate changes. Right, and there's definitely a chance, and it would appear as though the Earth is warming. Now the question is, what is the natural temperature of the Earth? What should the Earth's temperature be? And the truth is nobody really knows. We're still coming out of an ice age. From the research I've done, we're still coming out of an ice age. We don't really know what the optimal temperature for the Earth is. Maybe it's 5 degrees hotter than it is now. We don't really know. We just have a snapshot in time that's very, very small. You're talking about really accurate temperature reporting, maybe 50 years. And every time you change and you put concrete down rather than dirt, it changes the temperatures. And it's really, really difficult to come up with an accurate temperature gauge for what the Earth was 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago. And when you think of how old our planet really is, the fact that you've got a snapshot of 100 years, even if you had 100 years worth of accurate data, that 100 years is nothing. It's a blink. It's a hiccup in time. And so I look at this and I say, well, we don't really know what the optimal temperature of the Earth is, but there is some evidence that the Earth is warming. So you say, okay, that's not surprising. Climates do change. The question is man responsible for it? Is CO2 emissions really what's causing it? And then thirdly, is there anything that you could do about it if you decided that you wanted to try and change it? Like, is man capable of reversing a warming that's happening in the world? Or is it just a matter of, hey, sunspots are shifting, which is another theory that the sunspots are creating warming and cooling cycles on the Earth that go over hundreds and thousands of years? And so my whole point is, I don't really know, and I don't think anybody else knows. And the fact is, you won't find any credible climate scientist who will say that, yes, absolutely 100% man is responsible for all of this climate change, and the only way that we're going to solve it is if we get rid of some men. Right? What they will tell you is, yeah, we think that man is responsible for some of it, but how do we really know? That's what the credible ones will tell you. So when I read this, what I read is, a few years ago, worst case scenario was they were doom and gloom, as bad as it could possibly be. Now, we've done a little bit more research, and it's really about half as bad as we thought it was. Now, when I think about that, I say, okay, well, then clearly you guys don't really know what you're talking about. Clearly the verdict is still out on how bad this problem really is. Maybe it's super bad. But the truth is, you guys don't really know. You're guessing. And your latest guess puts it as half as bad as it was before. So how about we not mess with anything? How about until there's actually some clear evidence that you guys know what you're talking about? How about we don't go and start laying down a bunch of new taxes and a bunch of new regulation, a bunch of new carbon credits and whole new industries and systems and derivatives in the stock market that people have to pay for and trade? How about we don't do any of that until you guys unscrew yourselves and figure out what's actually happening in the environment? That's my vote. And then we all work together, because as I said before at the start of the show, I think all of us want a cleaner planet. I think it's reasonable for us to recycle and try not to destroy the planet that we live on. I don't think it should be government coming out and requiring you to do these types of things. Lots of times right now what's happening is for their own purposes, the trash men are starting to recycle versus trash because it's getting very expensive and costly to put trash in the ground. And so when I look at this, my initial response to this article is look, this is evidence that you guys don't really know what you're talking about. You're admitting it. And that's fine, because I didn't think you knew what you were talking about to begin with. But how about we don't go screwing with things and imposing all kinds of new regulation and increasing the cost of energy on everyone, which will, of course, disproportionately hurt the poorest among us, until you guys have some sort of actual evidence that we are the cause and that making these adjustments will actually fix things. And that's important. That's critical. Stay with me on that. It says, quote, "Our study all but rules out the very low and very high climate sensitivities," said lead author Peter Cox, a professor at the University of Exeter. It says, "These scientists have produced a more accurate estimate of how the planet will respond to an increasing CO2 level," said Peter Foster, director of the Presley International Center for Climate and University of Leeds. Now, here's where we get to the important part. You actually have to go to the second page. So I'm assuming that this was written for climate people, because the climate people would come out, and anyone who's been pro-climate change is going to be freaking out about this. So this is what they said. They said the findings should not be seen as taking pressure off the need to tackle climate change. The authors and experts warned, quote, "We will still see significant warming and impacts this century if we don't increase our ambition to reduce CO2 emissions. Even a 1.5 Celsius increase will have consequences." Now, Gabby, what is her last name? It can't ever be Gabby Smith. It's always going to be something weird. Gabby Hergel, a climate scientist at the University of Edinburgh, did not take part in the research, but added, quote, "Having lower probability of very high sensitivity is reassuring. Very high sensitivity would have made it extremely hard to limit climate change according to the Paris targets." So there it is. Did you catch it? Aha! Let me break it down for you. So they got a problem. This has been a problem for a long time because the doomsday scenarios have been so bad, so awful, that everyone is looking around and they're starting to ask, well, if it's as bad as you say it is, then there really is nothing that we can do. Like, there's no possible way that we can change. If the temperatures are going to rise by 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 100 years, and even a 2-degree change in temperature will, cause massive devastation to the earth, then we're already too late. There's no chance that we're going to be able to dial this back and we're going to be able to save our planet through all of these different programs and things that we want to run. And we put together this climate deal and set all that up, the climate accord in Paris, to try and put this together. And one of the things that came out of that, one of the criticisms is, well, number one, nobody had to lay anything on the line. They just gave their verbal word that they would do this. But secondly, apparently none of this is going to make a difference because there's already so much, we've already gone too far. And so the global climate scientists had to look at that and they said, well, how do we solve this problem? Well, what if we made it not as bad as we said? What if we fund a study and come up with a quote unquote more accurate number? And that more accurate number was, say, half of what we thought it was. And now we can come back and we can say, oh, no, it's really not as bad as we thought. It's only half as bad as we thought. But this is good news. Because it means if we institute all of these things that we wanted to institute, we might be able to save the planet. That's why we need to do this. And that's what was so funny about Gabby's response, is she said, oh, I'm so glad to hear that things aren't as bad. Because if they were, then we would never be able to hit our targets from the Paris Climate Accord. But since they're not, well, it's all full steam ahead. Let's get that crackdown running. Let's get those extra taxes instituted. Let's raise the price of energy, force people to pay more in order to save our planet. Get them off the coal, get them off the oil, and onto some sort of alternative wind energy, even though it'll cost 3 to 5 times as much. You cannot ever be fooled. There's always, every study is being funded by someone. This study that they put together here was not being funded out of the goodness of somebody's heart. These guys are getting paid to do these studies, and who do you think is paying for them? Paying them for them? It's not local donations. They don't have a GoFundMe account. No, it's governments who are funding. It's large corporations like the oil industry who's trying to convert over and take a piece of the new alternative energy market, that are putting together these studies and helping to frame up the argument that they are going to use. One of the things that you can use in marketing, we do this all the time in marketing. One of the things that you will do in order to provide social proof or to provide proof to your audience is you will use third-party statistics. I will give you an example of this. I'm putting it together right now for my podcasting course. As you know, I've already launched my podcasting course, but when I'm putting together some marketing material so that I can go out and sell this course to a broader audience than just my listeners here. And one of the things I'm going to show very early on is a report that was done by, I'll pull it up, by Edison Research, very large research firm that does all kinds of numbers for radio, and now they've started doing podcast numbers as well. Did you know that 112 million Americans have listened to a podcast? That's a third of America has listened to a podcast. 67 million Americans listen to a podcast every month, and 42 million listen every week. Podcasting has been growing from 10 to 20% a year. And not only that, but the key demo, the age range of people who listen to podcasts is starting to shift, and it's right in that key demo of 25 to 54-year-olds. Now, that's exactly the demo that people who advertise want to be advertising to. That's why you're seeing the number of dollars going towards advertising increasing every single year for podcasts. It's because people are recognizing that's where their audience is. And here's a really cool statistic. This is from Edison Research. Remember, podcast fans listen to 5 shows per week, and the average listener subscribes to 6 podcasts. Now, think about that for a minute. Average listener subscribes to 6 podcasts. He listens to 5 of them a week. That means that almost everything he's got on his phone, he's listening to. And 85% of them listen to all or nearly all of the podcast. You know what it is for radio? Like 5 minutes. That's the average listen time on radio is 5 minutes. If you have an hour-long show, 85% of you are going to listen to all or nearly all of this show. Now, I know you all will listen to every second of this because it's riveting. But my point is, those are numbers from Edison Research. And if I am going to go out and I'm going to validate to you why you ought to be in podcasting, I can tell you, oh, it's growing by leaps and bounds. It's a wonderful industry to be in. It's all great. And you got to trust me. Or I can go to Edison. I can pull their numbers and say, no, you don't have to trust me. Look at this third-party data. Look at what they say about the numbers in podcast growth, 10 to 20% growth a year. You think that's an industry you might want to be in? You think this is an industry you might be able to make some money in? Get out of here. I didn't even talk about money, how much of the billions of dollars that are going to be going into podcasting in the coming years. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that get spent on podcast advertising every single year, and it's only growing. Now, if that sounded intriguing to you and you're like, oh, well, where do I go get Jason's podcasting course? Well, that's what I'm saying. Third-party data. So if you're funding, if you want to prove that climate change is a thing and you want to go out and you want to advocate for some sort of new tax or new regulation, or you want to advocate for some sort of new subsidy for some program that you're starting, one of the things you might want to do, and it's a cheap expense, is to go spend $100,000, $200,000, $250,000 on a study to have them say everything that you want them to say. And then you take this study to Washington and you say, here, you see, well, this is why we need to have this. And I've got this new program. If we don't do it, the whole world's going to fall apart. But don't worry, it's not so bad that that's going to happen. We just need you to fund our program because now the new research says that our program would actually help. See how neat that works? It's just marketing. It's not bad. It's not evil. It's just they're just doing it. They're trying to, well, let me back that up. If you're falsifying data for the purpose of trying to fleece someone else, then yes, it is bad. So yeah, what they're doing in many cases is bad. Now, my comments about podcasting are not bad. That's legitimate numbers coming out of the growth of podcast audiences. But my point being is that these guys market like everybody else. The government markets to you. I'm hearing all over the radio. I hear advertisements from the government brought to you by this government agency or that government agency. They have a marketing budget to try and convince you that they need more money or that they have value that they're providing to you. Amazing, right? It's something that you have to consider anytime you look at this global warming debate, is that just because these guys are scientists does not mean that they're good people, and it certainly doesn't mean that they have your best interest at heart. They are certainly not all objective and trying to do the right thing. A lot of them are just trying to eat. And so you have to have the same kind of scrutiny that you have with the news and where you go to get your news. You have to have that same kind of scrutiny with every single piece of research that comes out. Because there is always an ulterior motive. There is always somebody behind it who's paying the bills. And the question you must ask is, who's paying the bill? And what are they trying to influence me to do or believe when I see this? Now, being a marketing rebel that I am, and having studied this stuff for close to a decade, well, over a decade now, this is something that is intuitive to me, and it is. When I look at this stuff, I'm immune to it. Like I instantly recognize it for what it is, but the vast majority of Americans don't see it. It's oblivious to them. And so what I'm trying to do here is kind of wake you up and show you that, hey, whether you are pro climate change or anti-climate change, whether you believe it's happening or not, whether you believe the government's got a responsibility to do something or not, is irrelevant to me. What's important to me is that you understand what's really happening behind the scenes. Nobody is looking out for you. That's why we teach this idea of individualism and personal responsibility. With individualism comes personal responsibility, because you are responsible for yourself. When things don't go your way, you don't get to turn to somebody else and say, well, they're the ones that screwed it up. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know that? It's your responsibility to know. You are responsible for your actions. You are responsible for your decisions. It's amazing how much carefuler people are when they are responsible ultimately for the outcome of their own actions. So anyway, the next thing we're going to talk about here, because I need to get to the Venezuela thing to get that done. But first, I want to talk a little bit about interest rate spikes here very briefly and tell you what's going on. And then we'll move on to Venezuela. But before we do that, let me tell you a little bit about our great sponsor, Policy Genius. Guys, each year, 30% of people make a resolution to be more financially responsible. And unfortunately, very few people end up fulfilling on that. But there is one thing that you can do today that will mean more to your family if something happens to you than anything else, and that's getting life insurance. And Policy Genius is the easiest way to compare and buy life insurance online. They let you compare quotes in just 5 minutes. It's almost unheard of to make a responsible decision in 5 minutes, but you can do it at PolicyGenius.com. Policy Genius has helped over 4 million people shop for insurance and placed over $20 billion in coverage. There's no high-pressure salesmanship with this. All you do is go on, you tell them a little bit about yourself, and they will give you quotes on insurance, life insurance, so that your family can be taken care of. Now, depending on who you listen to, they say you're going to need anywhere from 3 to 5 times your yearly salary, 5 to 10 times your yearly salary in insurance. It's important for you to understand. I have, let's just say this: I have a lot of insurance in the event that I would die, enough that my family would not have to worry. They would be taken care of essentially forever if they wanted to and they played their cards right. But I do that because I have a responsibility as a father to make sure that my family is taken care of if I'm no longer there. I am the breadwinner. So anyway, make a New Year's resolution to be a better with your money. Achieve it at PolicyGenius.com, the easiest way to compare and buy life insurance. There's zero sales pressure, no hassle, and it's free. Free to be the most financially responsible decision of your life. PolicyGenius.com. Get your New Year's resolution solved in 5 minutes. Okay, very briefly, with this spike in interest rates. So 10-year yields, that's on the 10-year Treasury, when we say 10-year yield, is now above 2.6%. It's the highest since last March. Now, why is that important? Well, as interest rates go up, certain parts of the economy end up getting hurt, one of them being housing. Housing is several times more rate sensitive than business investment, says Goldman Sachs. And Goldman is saying that we expect long-term rates to rise by an additional 100 basis points in the next 2 years. Now, 100 basis points is 1%. I know they always talk in basis points in financial stuff, and nobody who's not involved in finance knows even what that means. 100 basis points is 1%. So we expect long-term rates, this is Goldman Sachs, to rise by an additional 1% in the next 2 years as the Fed continues to tighten policy once per quarter, and the term premium rises. So they're worried that if interest rates continue to rise, that it is going to end up hurting sectors of the economy, among others, the housing market being the most critically damaged of those. Now, I have mixed feelings about that, because the truth is, if lending practices are loose enough, it doesn't really matter whether a house costs you, whether a house costs you 6% interest or 3% interest. It really is irrelevant, because people are going to have to move. They're going to have to buy and sell homes, and it will affect how much home you can buy and how much you can afford. But if the lending restrictions still stay, hey, we'll give you 95% loan to value or 90% loan to value, and you can come up with the 10% to put down. People were buying houses when interest rates were 10%. They were buying them all day. And so right now, if interest rates go up, it's going to be a shock for the short term, because people are going to realize, I can't get an interest rate at 3.5% anymore. I got to pay 5, 4, 5, 6%. But the reality of the situation is there are still going to be homes bought and sold, and I'm not entirely sure how deep the effect of that type of thing is on. I know it affects it, but the idea that the housing market is going to crash because interest rates go up, I don't know. You're going to see some slowing as some people who couldn't buy a house before or who could buy a house before now can't because they can't even afford entry-level homes. But for anybody who's established, who has to buy or sell because they're moving or leaving, there's still going to be houses that go. There'll be houses that move. It's just a question of at what price and how quickly. All houses sell. This is what I learned from my buddy who is in real estate. He said all houses sell. It's just a question of time and price. If you want it to sell quicker, price has to be lower. If you want it to sell at a higher price, sometimes you have to hold it a little bit longer. That's all there is to it. But all houses eventually sell. So, based on that and our understanding of interest rates, and if you go back and listen to earlier this week, I talked about interest rates as it relates to rising costs to the federal government. It says what happens when the government is now issuing debt and it's paying interest that's not 0.25%, but it's paying interest that's 2, 3, 4, 5%. And what's that going to do to what it costs them to finance that debt and pay the interest on that debt? It gets absorbed. It's crazy how quickly the numbers rise, trillions of dollars. And so we got to be very cognizant of that. And I gave you an out or in the show a couple of days ago. I explained how the central bank could orchestrate it so the federal government could continue to borrow money at very, very low interest rates while everybody else had to pay retail. Now, I want to shift over and talk a little bit about Venezuela. I have been getting comments on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jason_Stapleton. But I'm getting comments on Twitter about me not talking about Venezuela enough. And they said, hey, maybe you could talk about Venezuela a little bit more because the situation is getting worse. I feel like we talk about Venezuela all the time. I feel like I am always commenting on Venezuela, and I have tried to. We've been covering Venezuela for a couple of years now. Every time something new happens, we step in and I explain what's happening so that you can kind of follow the progression of the demise of Venezuela, because it is a real life, right before our eyes, socialist utopia imploding. Everything that we talk about socialism leading to, Venezuela is there. And they got there very quickly because they were very aggressive with their socialism. Hugo Chavez, very aggressive with his plan. So I'm going to bring it back up today, and we're going to talk a little bit about the next stage of this, and I'm going to try and tie it to cryptocurrencies and some of the discussions on interest rates that we had earlier in the week. But what I want you to understand is this is the way socialist policies end. It all sounds good on paper. From each according to, this is Marxism, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Socialism is this idea that we all give into this one big pot and then everybody gets a piece of the action. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or an attorney or a ditch digger. Everybody's going to be taken care of, and everybody's standard of living is going to be higher. The problem is it doesn't work that way in reality. It always implodes. It always fails. It always leads to price controls. It always leads to government corruption. It always leads to pain, starvation, and death every single time. Venezuela is no exception. So let me read to you from the Washington Post here. This is a great article by Mario Bello of Reuters. That's photos by Mario Bello of Reuters. This is written by, it doesn't say. But he's talking about the author is talking about a photo that he saw, a cell phone shot of trash strewn about, some wrapping materials, an old CD, debris left behind after a store was looted last week in San Felix, a city in Venezuela's southeast. He said what he couldn't stop thinking about was strewn about the trash were at least a dozen 20 Bolivar bills, just laying around in the photo, money just strewn about. Now this was after looting had occurred. It said according to the official exchange rate, each of those bills should be worth about $2. He said, but the official exchange rate has long deviated from the reality of the situation. And he said each bill is actually worth about $0.0001. And at the current exchange rate, it means that you need about 100 of them to equal 1 penny. That's $120 bolivars to equal 1 penny. They are essentially worthless, which is why the looters left them behind. They're good for nothing. He said 5 or 6 years ago, the bolivar, 500 bolivars on the floor would have bought a meal for 2 with wine at the best restaurant in Caracas. As early as last year, it would have bought at least a cup of coffee. Think about that. 5 or 6 years ago, you have an entire meal with wine at the nicest restaurant in town. And 4 years later, it'll buy you a cup of coffee. He said today, a year later, it will buy you nothing. He says prices are now rising more than 80% a month. At that rate, prices double every 34 days. Salaries lag far behind, leaving more and more in the country to face outright hunger. Now, I want to take you back to yesterday and talk about central banks. One of the things that I said would happen if interest rates got too high and the government couldn't afford to finance the debt is it would go to the central bank and it would say, I need a little bit of help here. Why don't you issue me special bonds that I can purchase, that you will purchase from me at a low interest rate of 0 to say 0.25% interest. And that way I can continue to operate. And the government begins to borrow money so cheaply that it doesn't even need to worry about about the money that it's spending. It just borrows and borrows and borrows, and no one else would ever buy that debt, but the central bank will buy the debt. And eventually that money ends up working its way into the economy. And when that money works its way into the economy, it starts causing inflation because when you're creating a bond and you're creating money, that money eventually finds its way into the economy. And as it comes into the economy in those types of numbers, you start to see inflation and then hyperinflation, which is what they're seeing in Venezuela. Venezuela's inflation happened differently. That happened because they just started the printing presses. But if the government gets into a position where it has to borrow to stay alive and it decides to borrow on the cheap and it sets a standard that it can go to the central bank and borrow as much as it wants for little to no interest, there's nothing to keep them from borrowing. Need to prop up the economy? We need more spending. We need money in this economy. Let's just go borrow some from the central bank and let's just pump it into the economy. Those are discussions that are happening in the central bank right now. Those are discussions that the government is having with the Federal Reserve. If the next recession hits, what are we going to do? They're frantically trying to raise interest rates right now without hurting the economy so that when the next recession hits, they can lower interest rates again. But what happens if interest rates go negative? What happens if that money starts to flow out into the economy? You can very easily see a scenario where what we saw in Venezuela happens in America. I know it's crazy to think that. I mean, it's almost beyond comprehension, but keep in mind 5 or 6 years ago, 500 bolivars on the floor meant a meal for 2 and wine at the best restaurant in Caracas. Today, it buys you nothing. It's not even worth a penny. Folks, it can happen that quick, in the blink of an eye. Now, the question is, what do you do about this? Well, when asked about it, Milton Friedman, one of the greatest advocates for free markets that has ever lived, said the only remedy for high inflation is high living. Now, what that means is if you want to get around high inflation, the only thing you can do is spend money. Spend it as soon as you get it. Don't hold on to a single dollar because that dollar is less valuable tomorrow than it is today. That means that money has lost its value. Let me explain it this way. That money has lost its ability to be a store of value. And so we have to look somewhere else to store value. So the author of this goes on to say the number one rule about surviving hyperinflation is simple. Get rid of your money. He says, find a can of tuna, buy it, even if you hate tuna. Even if you have no intention of eating tuna. He said you can always trade it for something else. You see, in a hyperinflation environment, in an environment where the currency is no longer a store of value, you have to find something else that acts as that store. And in Venezuela, it's become commodities. Any stuff that you have acts as a store of value because as hyperinflation continues to cut into 80% a month, that can of tuna can maintain its value. Now, I want to tie this as we close the show out today to our discussion about cryptocurrencies. Because as you know, I'm a fan of blockchain as it relates to creating an independent and free currency that's void of government inflation, government-caused inflation or central bank-caused inflation that you can't mess with. I like the idea of that. The problem is all you need to do is look at a chart of Bitcoin to understand why, if something doesn't change, it is never going to be that store of value that people want it to be. I'm pulling it up right now, and we talked. I can't remember if we talked about it before, but if you go back to say November of 2017, just back in November, you know what the average range of the Bitcoin market was? It was about $400 a day. That means that a Bitcoin fluctuated in value by about $400 every single day. You move forward to December 15th, just about a month later, you know what it was? Almost $1,300 a day it was fluctuating. Now, $1,300 a day, and that's when Bitcoin was trading at around $1,600 an ounce. So that means it was taking almost 10% swings intraday in value. Now, one of the critical pieces of a currency is that it act as a store of value. That means it has to be stable. There cannot be wild fluctuations in price. Otherwise, it loses its ability to be a store of value and therefore being a means of exchange that you want to hang on to. So if Bitcoin is ever going to be what people want it to be, there has to be some price stability in it. And right now, there is too much speculation in it. We've had a 50% swing since the beginning of this year in the price of Bitcoin. 50% decline from its highs, and the highs came in on 17th of December. 50% decline. That cannot be a store of value. It's a major hurdle that Bitcoin has to overcome if it ever wants to be what people want it to be. Now, if you want to speculate in the Bitcoin market, there's ways you can do it. You can trade it. You can, you be in and out on a short-term basis. But here's what you can't do, guys. You cannot hope to buy this to act as an actual currency because it has no store of value at this point. It has no stability as a currency. And it's one of the things that concerns me about it because if you look at Bitcoin, it's not unlike Venezuela. You cannot afford to come in. If you actually have your money in Bitcoin and that's where you're storing your wealth, you can't afford to come in and over the course of 3 or 4 days see a 20 or 30% decline in your wealth. It can't happen. A lot of people can't pay bills if that happens. Can you imagine if you got your paycheck, you put your paycheck in the bank, and if you're like most Americans, basically that paycheck is what you got to pay your bills that month, and beyond that, you're screwed. And can you imagine putting that in the bank in Bitcoin and then watching 30% of it decline over the course of the week? And now you only have 70% of your paycheck to pay bills with? It's not possible. You cannot do what you want to with the coin. That means at this point, Bitcoin doesn't function the way people want it to function. It may function that way in the future, but that makes it a dangerous investment. Doesn't make it a dangerous trading vehicle. It makes it great for trading because it's super volatile, which is exactly what you want when you're trading. But as a store of value, as a means of exchange, as an investment, not a good idea. The swings, the fluctuations are too much. I know 2 people who bought Bitcoin recently against my recommendation who are now they've basically been wiped out because they bought in the last couple of weeks and they've watched all of their revenue dissipate and they're now trading well below their entry. This is the problem. This is what I've been warning people about. You don't know when this is going to happen. And we don't know where it's going to go now. Maybe it goes higher. Maybe it goes lower from here. It managed to hold the support levels over the last couple of days. So maybe we see a rally out of it. I don't have any idea. But it's definitely disconcerting to see those types of moves in a currency that people are promoting as a viable means of exchange. And so what I hope you understand is that currency is important, currency stability is important. Now, the Federal Reserve has a mandate of 2% inflation. So controlled inflation, a controlled loss of your money, but stable. Not crazy back and forth, up and down all day long. So that's not optimal. Optimal would be you don't mess with the currency. The currency rises and falls based on the supply of gold, or the supply of wheat, or the supply of, acorns, whatever you want to tie it to. But when you have a government that messes with the currency, that creates money and pushes it into a marketplace, it destabilizes the value of that currency as a store of value. And when that happens, the currency becomes worthless. And it's only a matter of time before black markets explode, people are starving, and the government is turning around pointing the finger at somebody else. Because the government will never admit, no politician is ever going to admit that they were the cause of your pain and distress and struggle. It will always be somebody else's fault. So guys, thank you so very much for listening today. I really appreciate it. I hope you got some value out of this. Please share it with a friend. Please tell somebody about the show. I always say tell 3 people, 2 people that you think will like the show, and 1 person who, you're kind of guessing. Maybe he'll like it. I don't know. But I'm going to give it to him anyway because he needs to hear it. And if you'll do that, I'll be back here to do it all over again. Until tomorrow, be safe. Be good. I'll talk to you then.